Here is a dirty cleaning rag because that is all you will ever need." My sister-in-law smirked as she tossed the filthy stained cloth directly onto my son's lap in the middle of a crowded luxury steakhouse. The entire room erupted into cruel laughter. I watched my son hold that dirty rag, his graduation suit immaculate, and my phone buzzed with a message from my legal team. Perfect timing. Within minutes, her arrogant smile would vanish, and she would be begging me to stop. But I was done being the victim. Before I share the details of this unforgettable night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to see exactly how I destroyed the people who thought they could walk all over my family. My name is Desiree, and I am 42 years old. For over a decade, I endured the relentless disrespect of my husband Andre and his deeply toxic family. They looked down on me because I started my career working as a commercial cleaner, scrubbing toilets and mopping floors to make ends meet. To them, I was just the lowly help who somehow managed to trick their precious son into marriage. My mother-in-law, Shirley, was a woman obsessed with church politics and public image. She paraded around our community like royalty, demanding respect and treating anyone without a prestigious title like dirt beneath her shoes. Her golden child was my brother-in-law, Trevon. Trevon was 48 years old and carried himself like a billionaire business mogul. He ran a high-end restaurant downtown and constantly bragged about his elite social circle. He married Harper, a 35-year-old white woman who came from what she constantly reminded us was old money. Harper dripped with quiet racism and blatant classism. She viewed our entire family as beneath her, but she reserved a special kind of venom for me. She loved to use microaggressions to remind me of my place. And then there was Andre. My 45-year-old husband was a coward. He was a middle manager who spent his entire life desperately seeking validation from his mother and his older brother. He never defended me. He never stood up for our son. He only cared about keeping the peace and maintaining his fragile position in Shirley's good graces. But while they spent years mocking my cleaning business, they had no idea what I was actually doing behind the scenes. I did not just clean commercial buildings. I observed. I learned the real estate market. I took out loans and started buying up distressed commercial debts. Slowly and quietly, I built an empire. I am the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, but I kept my identity completely anonymous. Only my lawyers and top executives knew the truth. To my family, I was still just Desiree the cleaning lady. My son Jamal was the absolute light of my life. At 18 years old, he had achieved everything I ever dreamed of for him. He was brilliant, dedicated, and kind. This morning, he delivered the valedictorian speech at his high school graduation, and he was heading to Yale University in the fall on a partial scholarship. I wanted to celebrate his massive achievement properly. I booked the private dining room at the most exclusive steakhouse in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The tables were draped in pristine white linen, and the waiters wore tailored suits. It was a space designed for the elite, and I wanted Jamal to know he belonged in rooms exactly like this one. We invited 50 guests, including our extended family and close friends. The evening was supposed to be about honoring Jamal. Instead, my in-laws decided to turn it into a public spectacle of humiliation. The dinner had just concluded, and the waiters were clearing the plates to serve dessert. It was time for gifts. Friends and relatives stepped up to the head table, handing Jamal cards and small presents congratulating him on his hard work. Jamal smiled graciously, thanking everyone with the impeccable manners I had taught him. Then it was time for his uncle to present a gift. Trevon stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored jacket. He walked over to Jamal with a smug expression and handed him a small flat box. Jamal opened it to find a cheap plastic promotional pen with a bank logo printed on the side. Trevon laughed loudly, patting Jamal on the back. "Do not spend it all in one place, nephew. You are going to need a good pen to fill out all those fast food job applications when you drop out of college." A few of Trevon's friends chuckled. I felt a surge of heat rush to my face, but I kept my composure. Jamal politely said thank you and set the pen aside. But Harper was not finished. She stood up from her seat next to Trayvon, smoothing down her designer dress. She carried a gift bag that looked heavy. She walked to the front of the room, making sure every single person in the private dining space was watching her. She reached into the bag and pulled out a damp gray, heavily stained cleaning rag. It smelled faintly of industrial bleach and mildew. With a theatrical sigh, Harper tossed the filthy rag directly onto Jamal's pristine graduation suit. The heavy fabric landed right on his lap, leaving a damp, dark mark on his trousers. The entire room went dead silent. Jamal looked down at the rag, and then up at his aunt, his young face registering pure confusion and shock. "Here is a dirty cleaning rag," Jamal Harper said, her voice echoing loudly across the dining room. "That is all you will ever need. Your mother spent 10 years scrubbing toilets and taking out the trash, and that is the only legacy you will ever inherit. You think you are going to Yale. Please. You do not belong there, and you know it. Stop dreaming and learn your place. Grab a bucket and start scrubbing. It is in your blood." For a split second, the room was so quiet, I could hear the ice clinking in the water glasses. Then Trayvon burst into a booming, obnoxious laugh. He clapped his hands together as if Harper had just delivered the punchline of the century. Shirley, my mother-in-law, joined in, immediately covering her mouth and shaking her shoulders with amusement. Soon, their side of the family was chuckling, looking at my son as if he were a joke. I looked at Jamal. His shoulders slumped, and he stared down at his lap, his eyes welling with tears. He desperately fought to hold back. On the most important day of his life, the day he should have been celebrated as a scholar, he was being publicly degraded by a woman who thought her skin color and bank account gave her the right to crush a black boy's spirit. I did not yell right away. The rage inside me was so absolute, so entirely consuming, that it manifested as a terrifying calmness. I stepped out from behind the table and walked directly toward Harper. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You have exactly 5 seconds to apologize to my son before I make you regret you were ever born." Before Harper could even open her mouth to respond, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. It was Andre. My husband, the man who was supposed to be my partner, grabbed my arm and pulled me backward with rough, frantic energy. "Stop embarrassing me, Desiree," he hissed through his teeth, his face contorted with panic. He leaned in close, so only I could hear his cowardly whisper. "Harper's family has massive connections. They are influential people. Do not ruin Trayvon's night by causing a scene over a joke. A joke." My husband just watched a grown woman humiliate his child in front of 50 people, and his only concern was protecting his brother's wealthy white wife. I looked at the man I had married and felt nothing but absolute revulsion. I violently snatched my arm out of his grip. The sudden movement made him stumble backward. My voice carried across the room, clear and sharp, cutting through the lingering laughter. "You are worried about embarrassing yourself, Andre," I asked, stepping toward him. "You are terrified of losing face in front of these people. Where was this concern for our family this morning? Where were you when your son stood on a stage and delivered the valedictorian address to a crowd of thousands?" The room grew uncomfortably silent again. The guests who had been laughing suddenly looked down at their tables. Andre swallowed hard, looking frantically at his mother for help. "I was busy," he stammered. "I had important family business to handle for Trayvon." "Important family business," I repeated, my voice rising with every word. "You missed your only son's graduation speech to drive across the city and pick up Harper's dry cleaning because she demanded her specific silk dress for tonight. You chose to be an errand boy for a woman who just threw dirty laundry at your child. Let go of me, and do not ever put your hands on me again." Andre shrank back, completely emasculated in front of the entire room. He opened his mouth to argue, but Shirley slammed her cane against the hardwood floor. "Desiree, that is enough," Shirley commanded, her tone full of righteous indignation. "You are disrespecting your husband in public. You lack submission and grace. Brooke was merely making a practical joke about your background. There is no shame in honest labor, but there is shame in forgetting where you come from. Do not be so sensitive and apologize to your sister-in-law." My mother-in-law invoking grace and submission while defending a racist attack on her own grandson was the final breaking point. I turned my attention back to Harper, who was standing there with a triumphant smirk on her face, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. Manager Harper called out, snapping her fingers loudly in the air. "We need the manager right now." The general manager of the steakhouse, a tall man in a dark suit, rushed into the private room looking alarmed by the shouting. "Yes, madam, how can I assist you?" he asked nervously. Harper pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "This woman is causing a disturbance at my family's private dinner. She is aggressive and she is making the guests uncomfortable. I want her and her son removed from the premises immediately. Have security escort them out." Andre looked down at his shoes, completely unwilling to intervene, while his wife and son were being ordered out of a restaurant. Trayvon nodded in agreement, pouring himself another glass of wine. "You heard her," Trayvon said to the manager. "Get the cleaning lady out of here before she ruins our appetite." The manager looked at me, and then looked at his clipboard. He appeared incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you too," he began. I did not let him finish the sentence. I slowly unclasped my designer clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy, solid black titanium American Express Centurion card. I held it up between two fingers, letting the light catch the metallic surface. The manager immediately recognized the card. His eyes widened, and he took a step back, his posture instantly changing from authoritative to deeply respectful. "Remove me!" I asked, my voice echoing off the expensive wood-paneled walls. "Harper, who exactly do you think paid the $15,000 deposit to rent out this private room tonight?" I looked at the manager. "Please tell this woman whose name is on the contract for this event." The manager cleared his throat loudly. He looked at Harper with an expression of profound pity. "The reservation is under the name of Vanguard Holdings, madam," he said clearly, "and the payment was authorized directly by the chief executive officer." He gestured respectfully toward me. "This room belongs to this lady for the entire evening. If anyone is being removed, it will be at her sole discretion." The smirk vanished from Harper's face so fast it was almost comical. Her mouth dropped open and she stared at the black card in my hand as if it were a venomous snake. Trayvon nearly choked on his wine, coughing violently into his napkin. Shirley dropped her cane, the heavy wood clattering loudly against the floor. For a decade, they had treated me like dirt, assuming my value was tied to a mop and a bucket. They had no idea they were standing in my room eating my food and drinking my wine. And this was only the beginning. I kept my hand raised, the black titanium card completely silencing the room. The absolute shock on Harper's face was a masterpiece. She looked at her husband, seeking some sort of explanation, but Trayvon was too busy trying to compose himself. Andre, my spineless husband, looked completely bewildered. He had never seen that credit card before in his life. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, trying to process how a woman he thought he controlled possessed a financial instrument reserved for the ultra-wealthy. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Harper. My heels clicked against the polished floor, a steady rhythm that sounded like a ticking clock. "Do you understand what this means, Harper?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It means you are not the elite matriarch you pretend to be. You are a guest at my table. You are eating the expensive beef that I paid for. You are drinking the imported champagne that I selected. And you just threw a dirty rag at the guest of honor in my dining room." I turned my gaze to the manager, who was standing perfectly still, awaiting my instructions. "Sir," I said clearly, "this woman and her husband have worn out their welcome. However, I want them to stay for just a few more minutes. I want them to hear exactly what I have to say before they are escorted out of the building." The manager nodded briskly. "Of course, madame. I will have security standing by outside the doors whenever you are ready." Harper's face turned a violent shade of red. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, her voice losing all its false refinement. "This is a mistake. Trayvon, do something." Trayvon puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim his shattered dignity. He pointed a finger at me. I do not know whose credit card you stole, Desiree, or what kind of financial fraud you are running, but you are not kicking us out. We are the guests of honor here. Our presence validates this entire pathetic celebration. I smiled a cold, humorless expression that made Trayvon take an involuntary step back. Your presence validates nothing, I replied. You are a walking illusion, Trayvon. And as for you, Andre, I said, turning to the man I had given my youth and my heart to. You stood by and watched a racist, entitled woman attack the boy you helped create. You chose submission to your abusive mother and arrogant brother over the protection of your own flesh and blood. You are a disgrace to the very concept of fatherhood. Jamal stood up from his chair, the dirty rag dropping to the floor. He brushed off his suit jacket, his head held high. He looked at his father with an expression of pure pity. I am going to Yale. Dad. Jamal said, his voice steady and deep. And I am going to do it without you. You can stay here and pick up their dry cleaning for the rest of your life. The silence that followed was heavy with impending doom for the family that had tried to break us. I looked down at my phone. The screen lit up with another message from my legal team. The trap had been set and the jaws were about to snap shut. Perfect timing, I whispered to myself. I slid the phone back into my designer clutch. The destruction of their fake empire was going to be the most satisfying event of my life. The manager nodded respectfully, bowed his head, and quickly backed out of the room, closing the heavy mahogany doors behind him. The 50 guests in the private dining space were completely motionless. You could hear the faint sound of traffic from the city street below, but inside the room the air was thick with suffocating tension. Harper stood there with her mouth slightly open, staring at the spot where the manager had just confirmed my absolute authority over the evening. For a moment, the illusion of her old money superiority cracked, and the insecure, greedy woman underneath was exposed for everyone to see. But Trayvon was not a man who could handle being humiliated by a woman he considered beneath him. He was the golden child. He was the successful restaurateur. He was the man who paraded around our church and our community, demanding respect simply because he wore expensive suits and drove a leased luxury car. I watched him adjust his silk tie, his jaw clenching as he tried to figure out how to regain control of the room. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded more like a bark. He walked back to his seat and picked up his wine glass, pointing it at me with a dismissive wave. So you saved up your scrubbing money and blew it all on a fancy dinner, Trayvon sneered, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his wine. Big deal, Desiree. You rented a room for a few hours to play pretend. You want us to clap for you because you finally got to eat at a table you usually clean. The handful of Trayvon's friends at the back of the room let out nervous chuckles, unsure of whose side they should take. Trayvon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You can buy all the expensive steaks you want tonight, but tomorrow morning you still have to wake up and figure out how to pay for Yale. And we all know you do not have that kind of money. You are just a cleaner trying to punch above your weight class. Harper immediately recovered her composure, sensing an opening to strike. She smoothed her blonde hair and smiled that venomous little smile she reserved especially for me. Exactly, Harper chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Trayvon is right. It is honestly sad that you are giving Jamal false hope. Andre told us all about your little financial struggles, Desiree. He told us your credit cards are completely maxed out. He said you have been crying in the kitchen late at night because you can barely afford the electric bill, let alone an Ivy League tuition. Harper looked over at my son, her eyes full of malicious pity. You should really start looking into the local community college, Jamal. It is much more realistic for people from your background. There is no shame in following in your mother's footsteps and working a blue-collar job. I did not look at Harper. I looked at my son. Jamal was standing frozen next to his chair, his valedictorian medal still draped proudly around his neck. But the joy had completely drained from his eyes. He looked confused and terrified. He had spent the last 4 years studying until 2 in the morning, sacrificing his weekends, joining every academic club, and maintaining a perfect grade point average just to get into his dream school. Now he was standing in front of his entire family being told that he was too poor to attend. Jamal turned his desperate eyes toward his father. He looked at Andre silently, pleading for the man who helped create him to step up and defend his future. Dad. Jamal's voice cracked slightly, the sound echoing painfully in the quiet room. Dad. What is she talking about? You told me the college fund was secured. You showed me the account balance last month. What does she mean the credit cards are maxed out? Andre was a disaster. He was sweating so profusely that his dress shirt was clinging to his chest. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and he refused to make eye contact with his son. He grabbed a cloth napkin and frantically wiped his forehead, his eyes darting toward the exit as if he were calculating the fastest way to run out of the building. Desiree, please. Andre stammered, his voice high and thin with panic. Please just sit down. Let us talk about this at home. We do not need to do this here. Not in front of my mother. Not in front of Trevon and Harper. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I walked slowly to the head of the table, my eyes locked dead on my husband. I am not going to sit down, Andre, I said, my voice dangerously calm. And we are not going to talk about this at home. We are going to talk about it right here in front of the mother you worship and the brother you idolize. Because Jamal deserves to know why his father has been lying to his face for the past 3 months. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of bank statements. I threw them onto the center of the table. The heavy paper slid across the white linen, stopping right in front of Andre's trembling hands. Pick it up, Andre, I commanded. Read the balance on your son's college trust fund to the room. Read it out loud so your brother and his wife can hear exactly what kind of financial struggles we are having. Andre squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head back and forth. I cannot, he whispered. I am sorry, Desiree. I am so sorry. Since my husband has suddenly lost his ability to read, I will do it for him, I announced to the room. My credit cards are not maxed out, Harper. I have 0 debt. But you are right about one thing. Jamal's college fund cannot pay for Yale anymore because the account is completely empty. Jamal physically stumbled backward, his hand grabbing the back of his chair for support. Empty, he gasped. Mom, no. That account had $150,000 in it. I saw the statement. It had $150,000 in it until 90 days ago, I said, turning my gaze back to Andre. That was when your father walked into the bank branch downtown, the one where his cousin works as a teller. He presented a withdrawal slip to close the entire account. A withdrawal slip that required both of our signatures because the trust was jointly held. But I never signed that slip, did I, Andre? I never authorized anyone to touch my son's future. Andre let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying his face in his hands. He forged my signature. I continued, my voice rising with absolute certainty. My husband practiced writing my name for weeks on a legal pad he hid in his home office. And then he walked into that bank and committed felony fraud to steal $150,000 from his own flesh and blood. The guests gasped. A few of my aunts in the back row started whispering frantically to each other. Harper looked confused, glancing at Trevon for an explanation. Trevon suddenly looked very uncomfortable, shifting his weight and looking down at his empty plate. Where did it go? Jamal asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound heartbreak and rising anger. Where did my money go, Dad? What did you do with it? Andre could not speak. He was hyperventilating, tears running down his cheeks as the reality of his exposure set in. I walked over and placed my hand gently on Jamal's shoulder, steadying my brilliant boy. I will tell you where it went, sweetheart, I said, looking directly at Trevon. Your father took your entire college fund and wired it directly into the business account of a restaurant called the Sovereign. Harper gasped loudly, pressing her hand to her chest. Trevon's jaw dropped. He had clearly told his wife a completely different story about where his recent cash injection had come from. Andre stole your future, Jamal, because his older brother came crying to him in the middle of the night, I explained. Trevon convinced your father that investing in his high-end restaurant would guarantee a massive return. He promised Andre that they would double the money before your tuition was due. He told your father that funding his fake luxurious lifestyle was more important than your education. It was an investment. Trevon shouted suddenly, slamming his fist on the table to defend himself. It was a guaranteed return. Andre made a business decision for his family. You do not understand how real wealth is built, Desiree. You have to spend money to make money. We were going to pay it back with interest. You manipulated a weak man into stealing from his own child, I shot back. You are 48 years old, Trevon, and you are still begging your little brother to bail you out of your terrible financial decisions. You needed that cash because suppliers stopped delivering food to your kitchen due to unpaid invoices. You took a black boy's Ivy League tuition money to buy imported truffles and Wagyu beef to impress people who do not even like you. Suddenly, Shirley pushed her chair back. The scraping sound echoed loudly as my mother-in-law stood up. She gripped her wooden cane, her knuckles white with rage. As the head of the women's ministry at our church, Shirley believed her authority was absolute. She believed that whatever she decreed was ordained by heaven itself. She glared at me with pure hatred, her eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. So what if he took the money? Shirley yelled, her voice echoing with righteous indignation. So what if Andre gave those funds to his brother? Trevon is building a legacy for this entire family. He is establishing a high-class business that brings honor to our name. What do you expect him to do? Let his restaurant fail while that money just sits in a bank account doing nothing. I stared at the woman who had spent years preaching about morality and sin from the church pulpit. You are defending theft, Shirley, I asked quietly. You are justifying the fact that your son committed forgery and stole from your own grandson. Jamal is young, Shirley snapped, waving her hand dismissively at my son, as if his entire future meant absolutely nothing to her. He is a smart boy. He can go to the community college down the street for a fraction of the cost, or he can take out student loans like everyone else does. He has his whole life ahead of him to pay off debt. But Trevon's business is happening right now. Trevon needed that money to secure his position in the elite community. Andre did his duty as a brother. He supported the head of this family. You should be proud that your husband stepped up to protect his brother's legacy instead of standing here screaming like a common fishwife. The absolute audacity of her words hung in the air. She was looking at her grandson, a boy who had done everything right, and telling him that his dreams were collateral damage for Trevon's ego. Jamal looked at his grandmother with pure disgust, shaking his head slowly, as the final illusion of his loving family completely shattered. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at Shirley and felt a chilling smile spread across my face. I checked my watch, the gold hands glinting under the crystal chandelier. It was almost 5 o'clock. He did need the money, Shirley. I said, my voice dropping to a low melodic tone that carried to every corner of the room. You are absolutely right. Trevon desperately needed that $150,000. But not to build a legacy. He needed it because he is drowning. Trevon's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. The sovereign is not a legacy, Shirley. I continued, taking a step toward my mother-in-law. It is a sinking ship. Your golden child is $3 million in debt. He has not paid state taxes in 2 years. He has been taking out predatory loans to keep the lights on and buying fake reviews to trick people into eating his mediocre food. That restaurant is a financial black hole, and Andre's stolen money was just a single drop in an ocean of failure. Harper turned to Trevon, grabbing his arm. $3 million, she shrieked, her pristine image completely forgotten. Trevon, what is she talking about? You told me the restaurant was generating record profits. You told me we were expanding next year. He lied to you, Harper, I said, not taking my eyes off Shirley. He lied to you just like he lied to Andre and just like he lies to his mother. But the biggest problem for Trevon is not just the debt. It is who he owes the money to. And trust me, Shirley, I know exactly who owns the paper on your son's fake empire, because they are about to collect. Harper's face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The veins in her neck strained against her pearl necklace as she slammed her hands down on the white linen tablecloth. How dare you! She shrieked, her voice entirely devoid of that fake aristocratic restraint she usually wore. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at my face. You are nothing but a common maid. You smell like bleach and cheap soap. My family comes from old money. We built this city. My family's trust backs that restaurant, and we are the elite. You do not get to walk into a room like this and pretend you are on our level just because you scrubbed enough floors to buy one fancy dinner. The vitriol in her voice was thick with all the unspoken prejudice she had harbored against me for years. Shirley nodded along with her daughter-in-law, completely ignoring the fact that Harper was insulting the mother of her own grandson. Trevon puffed out his chest, standing behind his wife, as if her whiteness and supposed wealth were his personal shields. You think you can threaten us? Harper continued, grabbing her expensive designer phone from the table. I know exactly who manages the commercial plaza where our restaurant is located. My father plays golf with the developers. I am going to call the management office right now. I'm going to tell them that the owner of their nighttime commercial cleaning service is harassing their top tenants. I will have your little cleaning contract terminated before dessert is served. Let us see how you pay for Jamal's community college when you are unemployed and blacklisted from every building downtown. Andre lunged forward, trying to grab Harper's phone. Harper, please do not do this, he begged, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. She did not mean it. Desiree, apologize to her right now before she makes the call. You are going to ruin us. I swatted Andre's hand away without even looking at him. My eyes remained locked on Harper. Do it, Harper, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper. Make the call. In fact, put it on speaker so the entire room can hear how elite you really are. Harper smirked, a vicious, triumphant smile spreading across her face. With pleasure, she snapped. She dialed the number for the plaza management office and tapped the speaker icon, setting the phone down in the center of the table. The dial tone echoed loudly in the silent, private dining room. Everyone watched the phone as if it were a ticking bomb. While it was ringing, I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. You know, Harper, I said conversationally, it is fascinating how much you love to talk about your family's trust fund. You bring it up at every Thanksgiving and every Christmas, but you never mention what happened in the fall of 2022, do you? Harper's smirk faltered slightly. The phone continued to ring. What are you talking about? She snapped, trying to maintain her arrogant posture. I am talking about your father's bankruptcy, Harper, I said, projecting my voice so every guest could hear. I watched her face drain of all its color. I am talking about how his shipping logistics company went belly up and the bank seized your childhood estate. Your precious trust fund is nothing but a maxed-out line of credit that you have been secretly rolling over for 2 years. That is a lie! Harper gasped, looking around the room frantically as guests began to whisper. Trayvon looked at his wife with sudden confusion. It is public record for anyone who knows where to look, I continued relentlessly. You came into this family acting like royalty, treating me like the help when your own credit score is in the low 500s. You did not marry Trayvon because you loved him. You married him because Shirley brags about her life insurance policies at church, and you thought you could use her eventual payout to cover the massive shopping debts you are hiding from your husband. Trayvon stepped away from Harper, staring at her in shock. Harper, what is she talking about? Trayvon demanded. You told me your father was transferring $1 million into our joint account next month to cover the restaurant's operational costs. He does not have $1 million, Trayvon, I said, answering for her. He does not even have $100. Harper has been funneling the profits from your restaurant to pay off her father's creditors just to keep him out of federal prison. That is why the sovereign is $3 million in debt. You two are a match made in financial hell. Shut up, Harper screamed, slamming her hands over her ears. Just shut up, you lying, scrubbing maid. Right on cue, the phone on the table clicked, and a cheerful voice filled the room. Thank you for calling the Executive Management Office for the Downtown Commercial Plaza. This is Sarah speaking. How can I direct your call? Harper snatched up the phone, desperation making her hands shake. She needed a victory to regain control of the narrative. Listen to me, Sarah, Harper commanded, using her most entitled, demanding tone. This is Harper, wife of Trayvon, the owner of the Sovereign Restaurant. I am one of your most prestigious tenants. I need to speak to the owner of the plaza immediately. The woman who runs your commercial cleaning service is here harassing my family, and I demand that you terminate her contract right this second. Put the owner on the line, now. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence in the private dining room was absolute. Even Shirley had stopped breathing. "I am sorry, ma'am," the operator said, her voice filled with profound confusion. "I think there has been a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Harper shrieked. "I know the developers. I know the people who own the building. Put them on the phone or I will have your job too." "Ma'am, the plaza is no longer owned by the original developers," the operator explained carefully. "The entire commercial block was acquired last year by Vanguard Holdings." "Then put the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings on the phone," Harper demanded, her voice cracking with hysteria. The operator paused again, sounding incredibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings is Desiree. You are currently speaking about our boss." Harper stared at the phone. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood rushed out of her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very small. She looked from the phone to me and back to the phone, as if her brain simply could not process the words she had just heard. Trevin stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the dining table. The wine glass he had been holding slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor, spreading a dark red stain across the polished wood. Andre looked like he was about to pass out. He grabbed his chest, gasping for air, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Shirley sat completely frozen in her chair, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles were white. Her pristine reputation, her entire worldview where she was the superior matriarch and I was just the lowly help, was disintegrating right in front of her eyes. I reached across the table and tapped the red button on Harper's phone, ending the call. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at the shattered wine glass on the floor and then up at the people who had spent a decade trying to destroy my spirit. "You wanted to speak to the landlord, Harper?" I asked, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are looking at her. And you are right about one thing. We do need to talk about your lease." The heavy silence in the private dining room was thick enough to choke on. The dial tone from the disconnected call buzzed softly from the phone, sitting in the center of the white tablecloth, until the screen finally went dark. Harper stood completely frozen, her manicured fingers still hovering in the air where she had dropped her device. The blood had entirely drained from her face, leaving her pale and hollow. She looked around the room as if waiting for someone to jump out and announce that this was all a terrible practical joke. But no one moved. The 50 guests in the room were staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The revelation that the woman they had spent the evening mocking was actually the billionaire chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings had paralyzed them all. Traven looked like he was going to be physically sick. His chest heaved beneath his expensive tailored suit jacket. He kept looking from Harper to me, and back again, his arrogant facade completely shattered by the sheer magnitude of his own stupidity. He had built his entire identity on being the most successful man in the room, and now he was realizing he was just a broke tenant standing in a building owned by the sister-in-law he despised. But the most dramatic transformation was happening right next to him. Andre had been cowering behind his mother just moments ago, terrified of the conflict. Now his posture was changing. I watched my husband stare as his eyes bulged out of his head, and the operator words echoed in his mind. The panic that had been suffocating him was suddenly evaporating. It was being replaced by something much darker and far more pathetic. I could see the greed washing over his features. The realization of what $1 billion actually meant was flooding his brain. His breathing quickened, and a manic, greedy smile began to stretch across his face. "Vanguard Holdings." Andre whispered the words, tumbling out of his mouth as if he were speaking in tongues. "You are a billionaire. We are rich. We are actually rich." He practically shoved his mother aside as he stumbled forward. He was no longer the embarrassed middle manager who had allowed his wife and son to be publicly humiliated. He was suddenly a man who believed he had just inherited the world. He opened his arms wide completely, ignoring the disgusted look on my face, and stepped toward me with a loud, joyful laugh. "Desiree, baby! This is incredible!" Andre cheered, his voice echoing off the walls. Why did you not tell me? Why did you keep this a secret from your own husband? We never have to worry about anything ever again. We can buy that house in the hills. We can get Jamal into any school on the planet. Come here, baby. He reached out, attempting to wrap his arms around me to claim me and my wealth as his own property. He actually believed that after standing by while his sister-in-law threw a dirty rag at his son, he could just smile and step into a life of unimaginable luxury. He thought the title of husband gave him an automatic all-access pass to the empire I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears, while he was busy pleasing his mother. I did not step back. I stood my ground and brought both of my hands up, planting them firmly against his chest. I pushed him away with every ounce of strength I had in my body. The force of my shove caught him off guard. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. Do not touch me, Andre. I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. Do not ever put your hands on me again. The manic smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a flash of genuine anger. His fragile male ego had been bruised in front of his entire family and his wealthy friends. He straightened his jacket, puffing out his chest to try and regain some semblance of authority. You cannot push me away like that, Desiree, he demanded, his voice dropping into that commanding tone he only ever used when he felt threatened. I am your husband. I am the head of this household. Whatever you have been doing behind my back, whatever money you have been hiding from this family belongs to us. It is marital property. Shirley nodded vigorously from her seat, finding her voice again now that her son was asserting his dominance. That is right, Andre, she chimed in, pointing a shaky finger at me. A wife submits her earnings to her husband. That is the law of God, and that is the law of this state. You do not get to hoard wealth while your husband family struggles. Andre took another step forward, pointing at the floor between us. What is yours is half mine, Desiree. That is how marriage works. I do not care how many commercial buildings you bought or how many holding companies you started. You built that empire while you were married to me. My name goes on half of those assets. We are going to take that money, and we are going to fix Trevon Restaurant, and we are going to elevate this entire family to where we belong. Jamal watched his father with utter disgust, shaking his head at the sheer audacity of the man who had just stolen his college tuition. I looked at the man who had betrayed our son to pay for his brother's fake lifestyle. I looked at the sheer entitlement radiating from his pathetic posture. I slowly opened my designer leather bag. I reached inside past the black titanium credit card and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal paper bound by a heavy blue clip. I held the document up in the air, letting the bright light of the chandelier illuminate the thick black text printed on the front page. Do you remember this document, Andre? I asked, tapping the crisp paper with my fingernail. Do you remember what happened exactly 5 years ago in your mother's formal living room? Andre stared at the paperwork. He blinked several times, trying to process what he was looking at. The aggressive posture he had just assumed started to deflate. His eyes darted nervously toward his mother, who was now gripping her cane with white knuckles. Let me refresh your memory. I continued pacing slowly across the front of the room so every guest could hear the history of this perfect family. 5 years ago, I wanted to expand my commercial cleaning business. I wanted to take out a small business loan to buy industrial equipment and hire a larger crew. But your mother convinced you that I was a foolish woman with no business sense. Shirley sat you down and told you that my little cleaning company was going to fail and that my debt would end up ruining your pristine middle-class credit score. She told you that my failure would put your precious future inheritance at risk. Shirley shifted uncomfortably in her chair, looking away from my piercing gaze. The older women from her church who had been invited to the dinner began to murmur among themselves. So you brought a lawyer to the house, Andre, I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. You sat me down at the kitchen table and you handed me a post-nuptial agreement. You looked me in the eye and told me that if I wanted to play business owner, I had to do it completely separate from your finances. You demanded that I sign a legally binding document stating that all my business debts and assets were entirely my own. You forced me to sign away my rights to your modest retirement account and whatever scraps your mother plans to leave you when she passes. You wanted to make absolutely sure that what was yours and what was mine was mine. I tossed the legal document onto the table where it landed right next to the bank statements showing Jamal empty college fund. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. Well, Andre, you got exactly what you asked for, I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. This document has been updated and certified by the best corporate lawyers in the country every single year since you forced me to sign it. Vanguard Holdings was built entirely with assets protected under this exact post-nuptial agreement. The real estate, the commercial plazas, the liquid capital, everything is 100% mine. You legally severed yourself from my business 5 years ago because you thought I was going to be a broke cleaning lady forever. You get absolutely nothing. The realization hit Andre like a physical blow to the stomach. His knees actually buckled and he had to grab the back of a dining chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The billions of dollars he had just imagined spending vanished into thin air. He was not a billionaire. He was a middle manager who had just stolen $150,000 from his own child to fund a failing restaurant, and he had absolutely no way to pay it back. He opened his mouth, but he could not breathe. He just stood there gasping for air, his eyes wide with pure terror as the weight of his own actions finally crushed him. Shirley let out a loud, piercing scream. It was a guttural sound of pure panic and rage that echoed off the high ceiling of the steakhouse. She gripped her cane and pushed herself up from the table, her hands shaking so violently she could barely stand. She realized that her son had legally blocked himself from the greatest fortune this family would ever see. Her grand visions of church dominance and immense wealth were completely destroyed by her own arrogant advice from 5 years ago. She had engineered her own family financial exclusion simply because she wanted to keep the cleaning lady in her place. Trevon, she shrieked, turning her frantic eyes toward her eldest son. Trevon, do not let her speak to us this way. You are the real success in this family. Tell her, Trayvon. Tell this arrogant woman that you do not need her money anyway. Tell her that you are meeting with your investors tonight and signing the new 10-year commercial lease for the restaurant. We do not need her filthy money. Your restaurant is going to be a global franchise and you are going to be 10 times richer than her. Trayvon stood frozen, his eyes darting toward the window. He was trying desperately to maintain the illusion of his wealth, but the sweat pouring down his face told a different story. Harper was openly weeping now, clutching her designer bag as if it were a life preserver. The fake pearls around her neck rattled as she sobbed into her hands, entirely broken by the revelation that she was married to a fraud while the woman she abused held all the power. I turned away from my pathetic husband and focused all my attention on the golden child. I walked slowly toward Trevon, the heavy silence of the room amplifying every single step. The guests held their collective breath, waiting to see how the great restaurateur would respond to his mother's desperate plea. You are signing a new 10-year lease today, Trevon. I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly controlled. You are securing the future of your elite dining establishment right here in the very building that my company owns. Trayvon swallowed hard, trying to puff his chest out one last time. He grabbed the edges of his jacket, attempting to project the authority he had faked for years. Yes. He choked out, his voice wavering slightly. My investors are solid. The paperwork is done. I am the best tenant that Plaza has ever had, and you cannot touch my business. I stopped just a few feet away from him. I tilted my head, smiling coldly at the man who had mocked my son just 20 minutes earlier. The absolute dread in his eyes was glorious to witness. About that lease, Trevon, I said softly. I pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the table and sat down. The movement was slow, deliberate, and completely in control. I reached for my crystal water glass and took a small, unhurried sip, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat, while the people who had tortured me for a decade scrambled to pick up the pieces of their shattered reality. The private dining room felt entirely different now. The expensive floral centerpieces and the soft ambient lighting no longer felt like a stage set for my humiliation. They were the backdrop for my absolute victory. The 50 guests remained seated in stunned silence, watching me with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. I was no longer the lowly cleaner who scrubbed toilets to make ends meet. I was the landlord, and my tenants were currently suffocating under the weight of their own lies. Trayvon was pacing near the window, his face slick with sweat. He tugged at the collar of his custom-tailored shirt, as if it were suddenly choking him. He looked at his mother, who was staring blankly at the wall, and then at his wife, who was shaking uncontrollably. He could not accept that he had lost. His massive ego simply would not allow him to surrender to a black woman he had always considered inferior. Trayvon stopped pacing and puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim his alpha male persona. He pointed a trembling finger at me across the long dining table, trying to force his features into a mask of pure intimidation. "You think you can intimidate me?" "Desiree." Trayvon spat, his voice unnecessarily loud as he tried to project confidence. "You think buying a building gives you the right to ruin my livelihood? I am a premier client. My investors are wiring $5 million into my business accounts today. Do you hear me? $5 million. Your little real estate holding company cannot touch me. I have lawyers, Desiree. I have legal protections. You cannot just kick a commercial tenant out onto the street because you have a personal grudge. I have squatter rights. I have commercial tenant protections. The city will tie you up in litigation for years before you ever see the inside of my restaurant." He was throwing out legal buzzwords, hoping something would stick. He wanted the guests to believe he was still in control. He wanted Harper to stop crying and look at him with admiration again. Andre nodded along with his brother, desperately wanting to believe that Trayvon was too smart and too connected to be destroyed. Shirley even lifted her head, her eyes darting toward Trayvon with a faint glimmer of hope. They were all clinging to the illusion that Trayvon could outsmart me. The air in the room was thick and heavy. A few of the church elders in the back row shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another while keeping their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Jamal stood beside me, his valedictorian medal resting against his chest. He looked at his uncle with an expression of pure pity. My brilliant son was watching the man who had mocked him for holding a dirty rag completely unravel over a broken restaurant. I set my water glass down on the pristine white tablecloth. The clinking sound cut through Trayvon, desperate rambling like a knife. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out another manila folder, setting it squarely in front of me. I let my hand rest flat against the thick paper, letting the anticipation build in the room. Trayvon's chest heaved as he stared at the folder, his bravado slipping away second by second. "You do not have investors wiring $5 million, Trayvon," I said, my voice projecting a terrifying calmness. "You have loan sharks calling your personal cell phone every hour on the hour. You do not have top-tier lawyers protecting your business. You have a public defender representing your line cook who got arrested last week because your kitchen is a toxic hazard. And as for your commercial tenant protections, you lost those exactly 6 months ago when you stopped paying your rent." Harper gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at Trayvon with wide, tear-filled eyes, her flawless makeup beginning to run down her cheeks. "Trayvon, you told me the rent was paid," she stammered, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You told me the landlord gave us a courtesy extension because we bring so much prestige to the plaza. You swore to me that the business accounts were fully funded." "There was no courtesy extension, Harper," I corrected her, ignoring Trayvon's frantic attempts to silence his wife. "There was just me watching your husband ignore his lease obligations month after month while he leased a new luxury car and bought you diamond earrings to keep you quiet. There was just me collecting documentation while you paraded around claiming your old money status. But the unpaid rent is not even the best part. That is just a standard breach of contract. What really invalidates your lease is the criminal activity." The word criminal hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Shirley let out a small, choked noise, clutching her chest, as if she were having a heart attack. She was a woman who lived for church politics and community gossip. The idea of her golden child being associated with anything criminal was a fate worse than death. She reached out blindly, trying to grab Andre's hand, But Andre was too busy staring in horror at his older brother. Criminal Treven repeated, his voice dropping an octave as the remaining color drained from his face. You do not know what you are talking about. You are making things up to ruin my reputation in front of our family. You are just a bitter woman trying to sound smart. I opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photographs. I spread them out across the table so the guests sitting closest to me could see them clearly. The images were undeniable. They were clear, crisp shots captured by the hidden security cameras I had installed in the commercial plaza months ago. I watched as the relatives leaned in, peering at the glossy photos lying on the table. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Trevon, I said, leaning forward slightly so he could feel the full weight of my gaze. You violated your commercial lease by running an illegal underground poker ring in the VIP room of your restaurant. You turned a supposedly elite dining establishment into an unregulated gambling den. And you did it because you were desperate to pay off the massive shopping debts your wife accumulated on credit cards in your name. The dining room erupted into chaotic whispers. Aunts and uncles who had spent years admiring Trayvon suddenly looked at him with profound disgust. The church elders who had accepted his generous but fake donations were shaking their heads in disbelief. Jamal watched the uncle who had humiliated him be systematically dismantled by the truth. I have the security footage, Trayvon. I continued tapping the photographs on the table. I have hundreds of hours of video showing exactly who walks into the back entrance of your kitchen at 2 in the morning. I have audio recordings of the buy-ins and the payouts. I have the faces of every single illegal high-stakes gambler who sits at your tables drinking your unpaid inventory while Harper pretends she is old money. You brought violent, dangerous people onto my property to cover your wife designer shoe habit. You violated every single morality and legal clause in your commercial lease agreement. So as the landlord, I did not just reject your desperate application for a lease renewal. I filed for an immediate commercial eviction. Trayvon's legs gave out completely. He collapsed into his chair, staring blankly at the photographs on the table. The illusion was dead. The empire was gone. He was no longer a wealthy restaurateur. He was a criminal facing an immediate eviction and millions of dollars in debt. He looked like a deflated balloon, a pathetic shadow of the man who had thrown a dirty cleaning rag at my son. His hands shook as he reached out and touched one of the photographs, showing a notorious local criminal counting stacks of cash on a table, covered in expensive white linen. Harper suddenly transformed from a weeping mess into a vicious, cornered animal. She turned her entire body toward Trayvon, her face twisted with a rage so intense it was almost frightening. All the quiet racism and blatant classism she usually aimed at me was suddenly redirected at the man she had married. She slammed her hands onto the table, leaning over him like a predator. "You told me the rent was paid!" Harper shrieked, her voice echoing violently through the private dining room. "You told me everything was fine. You told me my family name was safe with you. If you have not paid rent in 6 months and you are running an illegal gambling ring in the back room, where is the money? Where did all the money go, Trayvon? Where did Andre $150,000 go?" Andre flinched violently at the mention of the money he had stolen from our son. He looked at Trayvon with the same desperate, questioning eyes as Harper. He had risked federal prison and destroyed his marriage to give his brother that cash. Now he was realizing that the money had vanished into a black hole of lies and illegal activity. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Trayvon, what did you do with Jamal College Fund?" Andre begged, his voice cracking. "You promised me it was an investment. You promised me we would double it. Where is the money, Trayvon?" Trayvon could not speak. He just sat there, shaking his head, his hands trembling as he stared at the tabletop. He had no answers. He had no defense. He had spun a web of deception so complex and so desperate that he had trapped himself entirely. He had stolen from his brother, lied to his wife, and endangered his entire family to keep up appearances. I stood up from my chair, slowly smoothing the fabric of my designer dress. I picked up my leather bag and closed the manila folder. I looked at Harper, who was still screaming at her broken husband, and then at Shirley, who was weeping silently into her napkin, her cane resting uselessly against the table. They had brought this entirely upon themselves. They had pushed me and mocked me and belittled my child. They had demanded a show, and I had given them a masterpiece of absolute reality. If you are also curious about where the money went, I suggest you stop screaming at each other and look outside, I said, my voice cutting through Harper, hysterical shouting. I walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city street below. The restaurant Trayvon owned, the Sovereign, was located directly across the avenue in the luxury plaza I now controlled. The large neon sign above the restaurant entrance flickered in the evening light, casting a faint red glow over the pavement. The city traffic moved slowly below a steady stream of headlights and taillights, illuminating the darkening streets. Harper stopped screaming and turned to look at me. Trayvon slowly lifted his heavy head, his eyes full of absolute dread. Andre and Shirley turned their attention to the window, their faces pale and drawn with fear. The guests in the room shifted in their seats, straining to see what I was looking at. "Why do you not ask the men in the black suits pulling up to the restaurant across the street?" I asked, pointing a manicured finger toward the glass. They all rushed to the window, pressing their faces against the glass to look down at the avenue. 3 matte black sport utility vehicles had just aggressively pulled up to the curb directly in front of the Sovereign. The vehicles blocked the valet lane entirely, their dark-tinted windows reflecting the city lights. The heavy doors swung open in perfect unison, and a dozen massive men in dark tailored suits stepped out onto the sidewalk. They were not police officers. They were not city officials. They were the very real, very dangerous consequences of Trayvon's illegal underground poker ring. They moved with terrifying purpose, completely ignoring the terrified valet attendant, as they marched directly toward the locked glass front doors of the restaurant. "They are not here for dinner, Trayvon," I said, stepping up right behind his trembling shoulder. I could smell the sour stench of fear radiating from his expensive cologne. "They are here to collect the debt you owe their boss. The massive gambling debt you tried to pay with my son's college fund. And since you do not have their money or a lease, I highly suggest you figure out exactly how fast you can run." The 50 guests in the private dining room practically pressed their faces against the thick floor-to-ceiling glass. The steakhouse window perfectly overlooked the busy commercial plaza, and the view gave everyone a front-row seat to the absolute destruction of Trayvon fake empire. It was exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The city street below was bathed in the warm, golden light of the setting sun, but there was nothing warm about the scene unfolding directly across the avenue. The Sovereign, with its pretentious gold lettering and velvet ropes, was being swarmed. It started with a fleet of dark, unmarked sedans, aggressively pulling up to the curb, completely blocking the valet lane. The doors swung open in perfect unison, and a dozen federal agents stepped out onto the pristine brick walkway. Even from our vantage point, several stories up the bold yellow letters printed across the backs of their dark windbreakers were unmistakable. IRS, Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. They marched past the bewildered hostess without pausing, pushing through the heavy glass front doors with terrifying authority. But they were not alone. Right behind the federal agents came a team of city officials carrying thick clipboards and heavy testing equipment. The Department of Public Health had arrived, and pulling up directly behind the sedans were 2 massive commercial moving trucks. The heavy metal ramps dropped down onto the sidewalk with a loud, echoing clang, and workers in thick gloves and boots began pouring out, marching straight into the restaurant. Trayvon let out a strangled gasp, backing away from the window, as if the glass itself had burned him. His legs hit the edge of a dining chair, and he practically collapsed into it, his eyes wide with unadulterated panic. He watched helplessly as the moving crew began rolling his custom-imported leather booths right out the front doors. Next came the expensive marble tables he always bragged about. They were gutting his restaurant right in the middle of the dinner rush. Patrons who had been enjoying their early evening meals on the patio were hastily escorted away by the agents, their expensive steaks and wine glasses abandoned on the tables. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious chaos unfold. I felt a brief, sharp vibration inside my designer leather clutch. I slowly unclasped the lock and pulled out my phone, the screen illuminated with a single new message from my lead corporate attorney. Perfect timing, the text read. The trap I had spent the last 90 days meticulously setting had finally snapped shut, and it had caught every single rat in the maze. I slid my phone back into my bag and turned my attention to Harper. She was pressing her hands against the glass, her breath fogging the window, as she watched the federal agents tape a bright orange notice of closure onto the front doors of the Sovereign. Her entire body was shaking violently. The fake aristocratic confidence she had tried to weaponize against me was completely gone, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate woman. I tipped off the Internal Revenue Service about the phantom employees you put on the payroll. Harper, I said, my voice slicing clearly through the heavy silence of the dining room. Harper spun around to face me, her flawless makeup beginning to run as tears welled in her eyes. The guests in the room gasped, turning their attention from the window back to us. I know all about the fake staff members you created. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. I know you generated fake profiles and fraudulent social security numbers to funnel untaxed money out of the restaurant business accounts. You thought you were an evil genius, using Trayvon Company to launder money like a common criminal. I know you used those phantom paychecks to secretly route thousands of dollars every month to offshore accounts, just to cover the massive interest loans your bankrupt father took out. You drained this family resources to save your own pathetic old money image. The IRS loves a good paper trail. Harper and I handed them yours on a silver platter. Harper opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked like she was suffocating. She knew she was caught. She knew that at this very moment, federal agents were ripping apart her fraudulent accounting books and seizing every computer in that building. I turned my gaze to Trayvon, who was sitting with his head in his hands, pulling at his own hair. And I tipped off the health inspector about the black mold you refused to fix in the basement prep kitchen. Trayvon, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. I know you paid off a cheap, unlicensed contractor to paint over the massive water damage because you did not want to spend the money for a proper environmental remediation. You were serving expensive luxury food out of a toxic biological hazard zone while you bragged to our entire church congregation about your elite standard of living. You poisoned your own business and endangered public health just to save a few $1,000s so you could keep leasing luxury cars. Trevin groaned, a pathetic sound of complete surrender. He did not even try to defend himself. The truth was too absolute. I looked back out the window, pointing down at the workers who were currently loading massive commercial refrigerators and imported stoves onto the moving trucks. And my men are currently repossessing every single piece of equipment in that building, I announced. You see, Trayvon, when you operate a business in my commercial plaza and you default on your lease while committing federal fraud, the landlord has the right to seize all operational assets to cover the damages. Every velvet chair, every crystal glass, every stainless steel oven, they are mine now. I am going to liquidate every last spoon in that kitchen to put the money exactly where it belongs. I am putting it right back into my son's stolen college fund. Andre stood completely frozen near the head table. The sheer magnitude of the crimes his brother and his sister-in-law had committed was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had risked federal prison. He had forged my signature. He had stolen $150,000 from his own brilliant child to give to his older brother. And Trayvon had used that money to fund an illegal underground poker ring and a money laundering scheme for his racist wife. Andre looked at his mother, his eyes wide with profound betrayal and overwhelming panic. You told me he was a genius, Mom. Andre whispered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. You told me giving him Jamal money was the smartest thing I could ever do for this family. You said it was an investment. He is going to federal prison, Mom, and he is going to drag me down with him. Shirley could not speak. The powerful matriarch who always had a scripture ready to justify her cruelty and elevate her golden child was completely silent. She slumped heavily in her chair, staring blankly at the floor. Her entire social standing, her prestigious position in the church, her pride in her eldest son, everything was reduced to ashes in a matter of minutes. The older women from the women ministry who sat at the back tables were already whispering furiously to each other, pulling out their phones to text the rest of the congregation. The gossip was spreading through our community faster than a wildfire. Shirley realized in that moment that she would never be able to show her face in church again. Her legacy was destroyed. Harper slid down the glass window, slowly sinking to her knees right in front of me. The arrogant white woman who had gleefully tossed a filthy damp cleaning rag onto my son's immaculate graduation suit was now kneeling at my feet. Her expensive silk designer dress pooled around her on the floor, soaking up the spilled wine from Trayvon broken glass. She looked up at me, her face twisted in pure agony. Her hands reached out, hovering just inches from my shoes, but she did not dare touch me. She knew exactly who held her entire life in their hands. "Don't do this," Harper whispered, her voice broken and pathetic, a mere shadow of the woman who had demanded the manager throw me out. "Please, Desiree, don't do this. I will lose everything. My family name will be ruined forever. I will go to jail. Please don't do this to us." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity in my heart. I thought about the years of microaggressions. I thought about the way she looked at my son as if he were a criminal instead of a scholar. I thought about the dirty rag sitting on the floor. "I didn't do it, Harper," I replied, my voice cold and entirely unyielding. "Your greed did." The silence in the room stretched out heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of Harper pathetic sobbing. Jamal stood tall beside me, his head held high, his eyes clear. He was watching the people who had tried to break his spirit face the ultimate reckoning. He finally understood that he did not need their validation. He had a mother who would burn the world down to protect his future. Suddenly, a loud commotion echoed from the hallway outside our private dining room. Heavy footsteps approached, moving with urgent, chaotic energy. The heavy mahogany doors burst open with tremendous force, slamming loudly against the walls. The 50 guests turned around collectively, gasping in shock. Standing in the doorway, flanked by the nervous, sweating steakhouse manager, were 3 prominent church elders. And standing right in the center of them, looking absolutely furious, was the bishop himself. They wore their dark Sunday suits, their faces set in expressions of grave, monumental disappointment. They had not come to celebrate a graduation. They had not come to enjoy a fine steak dinner. They had come to deliver a reckoning. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room slammed against the walls with a tremendous crash. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room, cutting through the sound of Harper crying and Trayvon pathetic whimpering. The steakhouse manager was sweating profusely, his face pale with panic. He pointed a trembling finger toward our table and then quickly backed out into the hallway, pulling the heavy doors closed behind him. He wanted absolutely no part of the reckoning that had just arrived. The bishop of our church stood in the doorway. He was a tall, imposing man who had led our congregation for over 30 years. His face was set in a mask of absolute fury, his jaw tight and his eyes dark with righteous anger. Standing directly behind him, flanking him like soldiers, were Elder Thomas, Elder Jackson, and Elder Williams. They were the 3 most respected men in our community. They were the men who controlled the church finances, who sat on the executive board, and who dictated the social hierarchy that my mother-in-law worshipped with her entire being. Shirley saw the bishop, and her entire demeanor changed in the blink of an eye. The woman who had just been sitting frozen in shock, terrified by the federal agents raiding her son's restaurant, suddenly sprang to life. She saw an opportunity to save her precious reputation. She transformed instantly into the persecuted saint she always played on Sunday mornings. She arranged her face into a mask of pure tragic suffering. She forced fresh tears to well up in her eyes, and her hands began to tremble with fake religious fervor. She grabbed her wooden cane and hobbled toward the bishop, moving as fast as her old legs could carry her. She let out a loud theatrical sob, reaching her hands out toward the men she believed would protect her. "Bishop," she cried, her voice echoing with manufactured agony. "Bishop, you must help us. You must pray for this family right now. The devil has entered this room tonight." Shirley pointed a shaking finger over her shoulder directly at me. "Desiree is attacking us," she wailed. She is telling wicked lies about my Trevin. She is trying to destroy the beautiful legacy my son is building for our community. She is a bitter, jealous woman, and she has brought spiritual warfare to my grandson graduation dinner. She is trying to steal our joy, Bishop. Please tell her that God will punish her for these vicious lies. She is trying to ruin a good Christian man. I stood perfectly still near the window, watching the performance unfold. For over a decade, I had watched Shirley use her religion as a weapon to control her sons and manipulate everyone around her. Her entire identity was tied to her status as the head of the women ministry. She sat in the front pew every Sunday, wearing an expensive custom hat, judging every other woman in the building. She truly believed that because of her title, the bishop would wrap his arms around her and defend her golden child against the lowly cleaning lady she despised. But the bishop did not move. He did not reach out to comfort her. He did not offer a prayer of protection or a warm embrace. He stood completely rigid, his face carved out of cold, hard stone. He looked down at Shirley with an expression of absolute profound disgust. The three elders flanking him held the exact same expression. They looked at the matriarch of this family as if she were a disease that had infected their congregation. The bishop slowly reached into his dark suit jacket. He pulled out a thick black leather-bound ledger. I recognized that book immediately, and so did everyone else in our family. Every person in our church knew that specific book. It was the master ledger for the congregation building fund. It was the sacred account that held the life savings of hundreds of working-class families who had donated their hard-earned money for 10 years to build a new community center for the local youth. Shirley the bishop said, his voice booming across the private dining room. His tone was completely devoid of any warmth or pastoral care. He sounded like a judge handing down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. You do not get to speak about the devil tonight. You do not get to invoke the name of God to cover up the vile sins you brought into my church. Shirley stopped crying instantly. Her fake tears dried up and her hands fell slowly to her sides. She stared at the black leather ledger, the color completely draining from her face. Bishop, I do not understand, she stammered, her voice losing its theatrical tragedy and replacing it with genuine panic. I am the head of the women ministry. I am a faithful servant. You understand perfectly well, the bishop continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to back up. You used your position of trust to manipulate the most vulnerable people in our congregation. You stood at the pulpit for the last 3 months, and you convinced the elderly widows and the hardworking families to invest their money into your son restaurant. You told them it was a guaranteed return. You told them Trevon was a blessed businessman who would double the church building fund before the end of the year so we could finally break ground on the youth center. Trevon let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the back of the room. He sank lower into his chair, trying to make himself invisible as the reality of his crimes was broadcast to the entire room. Harper was staring at her husband with wide, unblinking eyes, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of the fraud she had married into. They had not just stolen from a bank, they had stolen from the church. You convinced the financial committee to authorize a transfer of $200,000, the bishop said, holding the black ledger high in the air so every single guest in the dining room could see it. $200,000 of sacred money, Shirley. Money meant to build a safe place for children. And you handed it over to your son because he told you he needed to expand his elite dining room to attract wealthier clients. Shirley swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward Elder Thomas and Elder Jackson, hoping to find any trace of sympathy. Bishop, it was a safe investment, she pleaded, her voice cracking as her perfect world began to burn. Trevon was going to pay it back with interest. It was supposed to be a massive blessing for the church. The restaurant is a huge success. My son is a brilliant man. The restaurant is a crime scene, Shirley, the bishop roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers above our heads. He slammed the black ledger down onto the nearest dining table. The heavy thud made Andre jump out of his skin. The bank manager called me directly on my personal cell phone exactly 1 hour ago. He called to inform me that the church account has been locked. The $200,000 transfer to the sovereign bounced back this afternoon, flagged by federal authorities for suspicious activity. The bishop took another step forward, towering over my mother-in-law, projecting a terrifying authority. The bank informed me that your son's business accounts are frozen due to criminal fraud and money laundering investigations. They told me that federal agents were securing warrants for the property as we speak. You brought a thief into the house of God, surely. You sold out your own congregation to fund an illegal gambling den and a massive fraud scheme. You have disgraced yourself. You have disgraced your family, and you are stripped of your title and your position in our church, effective immediately. You are no longer welcome in our sanctuary. The room was so incredibly quiet you could hear the distant wail of police sirens down on the street below as more authorities arrived at the restaurant across the plaza. Shirley stood there completely paralyzed. The words washed over her, destroying the only thing she truly cared about in this world. Her holy reputation was gone forever. Her social standing was obliterated. She was no longer the respected matriarch who commanded obedience from everyone she met. She was now the woman who helped her criminal son steal from widows and children to pay for expensive steaks and leased luxury cars. She slowly turned her head to look at Trayvon. The realization finally cracked through her thick skull. Trayvon did not just lose his restaurant tonight. He had lied to her for months. He had used her blind faith in him to rob her own church. He had taken her pride and her reputation and traded it for a few months of fake luxury to impress a blonde woman who hated their entire family. Trayvon saw his mother looking at him. He tried to stand up, his legs trembling so violently he had to lean against the table for support. "Mom," he stammered, holding his hands out in a gesture of pathetic surrender. "Mom, please, I can explain everything. It was just a cash flow problem. The business was struggling because of the economy. I was going to fix it, I swear. The investors were supposed to come through today. I just needed a little more time to make the money back." Shirley did not say a word. She dropped her wooden cane onto the floor. It clattered loudly against the hardwood, but she did not even flinch. She walked slowly toward the back of the room, moving with a terrifying, singular focus. Every guest moved out of her way, giving her a wide path to reach the table. She walked right up to the golden child, the son she had worshipped, the son she had constantly compared to my husband, the son she had used to belittle me and mock my career for over a decade. Trayvon opened his mouth to offer another pathetic excuse, trying to charm his way out of the disaster just like he always did. Shirley raised her right hand and brought it across his face with a sickening, violent crack. The slap echoed through the dining room like the crack of a whip. It was a physical blow filled with decades of misplaced pride and the sudden crushing weight of reality. Trayvon's head snapped aggressively to the side. He stumbled backward, crashing into the wood-paneled wall and sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. He held his red, stinging cheek, staring up at his mother in absolute shock. The perfect family unit completely shattered right before my eyes. The polite, aristocratic facade they had maintained for years was dead, and the ugly, vicious truth underneath was crawling out to consume them all. Trayvon looked up from the floor, his cheek burning, and his eyes filled with absolute venom. He could not accept the blame for his own failures. He had never accepted the blame for anything in his entire life. He instantly turned his rage onto his wife, looking for a scapegoat to carry the weight of his crimes. "This is your fault!" Trayvon screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Harper, who was still kneeling on the floor in her ruined designer dress. "You did this to me. You drained every single account I had. I only needed the church money because you stole the restaurant operating funds to pay off your father's massive bankruptcy debts. You promised me your family trust fund would cover the restaurant expansion. You lied to me about your old money status. You dragged me into that underground poker ring because you owed loan sharks hundreds of thousands of dollars for your fake designer lifestyle. You ruined my life, you pathetic fraud." Harper's face twisted into a mask of pure demonic fury. The refined, polite socialite completely vanished. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the spilled wine dripping from the hem of her expensive dress. She lunged toward Trayvon, screaming at the top of her lungs. She did not care about the bishop or the elders or the 50 guests watching their marriage violently implode. "You are a failure," Harper shrieked, her voice raw and unhinged, pointing her finger right in his face. "You were supposed to be a brilliant restaurateur, but you are nothing but a cheap cook who leased a car he could not afford to impress people who do not even like you. I only took the church money because your stupid brother was too slow." Harper spun around and directed her absolute raging venom toward Andre. My husband flinched, shrinking back against the head table as the furious blonde woman turned on him. Andre was supposed to bring the $150,000 from Jamal College Fund. "Weeks ago," Harper yelled, pointing directly at my terrified husband. "You promised us that money, Andre. You told Trevon you had forged the signature and the cash was ready to go. But you are a miserable coward. You took too long to wire the funds to the business account, and the loan sharks told us they were going to break Trevon's legs if we did not pay them by Friday. I had to take the church money because you are a weak, pathetic man who could not even steal from his own son correctly." The entire room gasped in perfect unison. Andre was completely exposed. There was nowhere left for him to hide. The people he had sacrificed his own son for, the people he had bowed down to his entire life, were now throwing him to the wolves to save themselves. His wife was a billionaire who had orchestrated their total destruction without raising her voice. His older brother was a federal criminal, sitting on the floor weeping like a child. His sister-in-law was a broke fraud, screaming about loan sharks and underground poker rings. And his mother, the woman he had sought validation from since he was a little boy, was standing over the ruins of her disgraced reputation, completely broken and stripped of all her power. They were tearing each other apart like starving animals trapped in a cage. The family loyalty they had always bragged about, the superior bond they claimed, elevated them above. My working-class roots was nothing but a fragile illusion built entirely on greed and lies. And the absolute moment the money ran out, the loyalty evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing but vicious betrayal. Andre looked at his mother, hoping she would defend him like she always did. But Shirley just stared at the floor, her shoulders shaking as she wept for her lost social status. He looked at Trevon, who was glaring at Harper with absolute, unadulterated hatred. He looked at the bishop, who was staring at the entire family with profound disgust, shaking his head at the depravity they had brought into the light. Andre realized in that exact moment that he had absolutely no one left. He had burned every single bridge. He had destroyed his own home and betrayed his own flesh and blood to impress people who fundamentally hated him. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. I was standing near the window, my posture perfectly straight, my designer bag resting in my hands. The heavy legal post-nuptial document was still sitting on the table, a silent reminder of the absolute power I held over his financial future. I was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I was the landlord who owned the building where his brother committed federal crimes. I was the woman who had quietly built an empire while he was busy fetching dry cleaning and kissing his mother's feet. I did not look angry. I did not look sad. I looked at him with the cold, detached calculation of an apex predator watching its prey finally bleed out. Andre's legs began to tremble. His breathing grew ragged and shallow, echoing loudly in the tense silence of the room. He took a slow, agonizing step away from the head table. The room was perfectly silent except for Harper heavy panting and Shirley quiet, mournful sobs. Everyone watched as my husband, the man who had ordered me to stop embarrassing him just an hour ago, walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor toward me. He stopped just 2 feet away from where I stood. He looked into my eyes and saw the absolute conviction reflecting back at him. He looked at Jamal, who was standing beside me, radiating the kind of academic strength and moral integrity Andre had never possessed. Andre's knees simply gave out. He dropped heavily to the floor. The sound of his knees hitting the hardwood echoed through the silent dining room like a final judgment. He slumped forward, resting his hands on the floor right in front of my expensive heels. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking as he began to cry uncontrollably. The arrogant middle manager, the man who had stolen his son's future to please his toxic family, was now kneeling at the feet of the cleaning lady he had always considered beneath him, Desiree. Andre whispered, his voice a pathetic broken croak as his tears hit the polished floor. Please, Desiree. I have nothing. I am so sorry. Please save me. Please do not leave me with them. Please help me. I looked down at the top of his head. I watched the man I had married completely humiliate himself, begging for mercy from the woman he had betrayed for over a decade. I felt the cool glass of the window behind me. I felt my son standing strong and protected beside me. I looked down at Andre, and I felt absolutely nothing but the sweet, perfect taste of absolute victory. The man who had promised to protect me and honor me was literally dragging his body across the floor. Andre grabbed the hem of my dress, his tears soaking into the expensive fabric. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood there letting him marinate in his own pathetic desperation. He looked up at me, his face red and swollen, his eyes wide with a frantic, terrified energy. The polished facade of the successful middle manager was completely gone. He was nothing but a hollow shell of a man terrified of losing the comfort he had never actually earned. Desiree, please, you have to listen to me, Andre sobbed, his voice echoing in the silent room. They made me do it. They forced me into this. He turned his head and pointed a shaking finger directly at his mother. Shirley flinched as her own son turned against her. Shirley told me to take Jamal money, Andre screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. She sat me down in her living room and she told me that Trevon needed the cash to secure the family legacy. She said Jamal could just take out student loans like everyone else. She told me that your money was my money and that a good son always helps his mother. She poisoned my mind, Desiree. She made me believe I was doing the right thing for the family. She manipulated me. Shirley let out a loud gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Her own golden boy, her compliant, obedient son, was throwing her directly under the bus to save his own skin. The elders from the church watched in absolute disgust as the matriarch was betrayed by the very son she had manipulated for decades. But Andre was not finished. He scrambled slightly, turning his frantic pointing finger toward his brother and his sister-in-law. Trayvon was still sitting on the floor nursing his slapped cheek, while Harper was wiping her running mascara. And Trayvon pressured me every single day, Andre yelled, his face contorted with panic. He told me I was a failure if I did not invest in his restaurant. He promised me we would be millionaires. He said we would never have to worry about anything ever again. And Harper was the one who told me you were just a stupid maid. Harper had snapped up her eyes wide with shock as Andre exposed her vicious words to the entire room. She laughed at you. Desiree, Andre cried desperately, trying to align himself with me by destroying them. She sat in our kitchen drinking our wine, and she told me you would never be anything more than a glorified cleaning lady. She said you did not deserve the money you were making. She told me to take control of the finances because you were too ignorant to handle real wealth. They all plotted against you, Desiree. But I can make it right. I will testify against them. I will go to the police and tell them everything about the underground poker ring and the fraud. I will be your star witness. Just do not leave me, please. Do not leave me with them. The sheer cowardice radiating from him was almost hard to witness. He had no loyalty to anyone. He had spent his entire life bowing to his mother and his brother, and the absolute second the ship started sinking, he was desperately trying to drown them all to keep himself afloat. He reached out again, trying to wrap his arms around my legs to secure himself to my absolute power. Do not touch her. The voice was deep and steady, and it commanded absolute authority. It did not come from me, it came from my right side. Jamal stepped forward. My beautiful, brilliant 18-year-old son moved to stand directly between me and his father. He looked down at the man kneeling on the floor, and the expression on his face was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. Jamal had spent his entire childhood seeking his father's approval. He had joined the chess club and the debate team and earned perfect grades, hoping that one day Andre would look at him with the same pride he reserved for Trevon's empty accomplishments. But that boy was gone. The young man standing in front of me was forged in the fire of my resilience. Andre looked up at his son, his eyes pleading. Jamal, please tell your mother. Tell her I was just trying to help our family. You do not even know what my major is going to be. Dad, Jamal said. his voice ringing with a cold, hard truth that echoed off the dining room walls. "You sat in our living room for the last 4 years, and you never once asked me about my college applications. You never asked me what I wanted to do with my life. You stole my tuition money and gave it to a criminal because you wanted to feel important." Andre opened his mouth to make another excuse, but Jamal cut him off immediately. "You are a coward," Jamal continued, stepping closer and forcing Andre to shrink back against the floor. "You let Uncle Trayvon mock me in front of this entire room. You let him throw a dirty rag at me, and you did not say a single word. You just sat there smiling because you were too terrified of upsetting your mother. You watched your own son be humiliated, and you did absolutely nothing." Jamal pointed a finger down at Andre, his voice trembling slightly with a profound, deep-seated anger. "Mom worked until her hands bled to give me a future. She scrubbed floors and built an empire while you sat in expensive bars drinking scotch with Trayvon, pretending you were a wealthy businessman. You are nothing but a fraud, Dad. You traded your own family for a seat at a table that does not even exist anymore. So do not you ever try to touch her again." The silence that followed Jamal's words was absolute. Andre stared at his son, completely broken. The last shred of his dignity was gone. He had lost his wife, he had betrayed his mother and his brother, and now his only child had looked him in the eye and stripped away the final illusion of his manhood. Andre slowly lowered his head to the floor, covering his face with his hands, as he sobbed a pathetic, hollow sound that elicited absolutely no sympathy from anyone in the room. I reached out and placed my hand gently on Jamal's shoulder. My son stood tall, his chest rising and falling as he processed the magnitude of what he had just done. He had reclaimed his own power. He had broken the generational cycle of weakness and compliance that had infected this family for decades. I looked around the room, watching the guests process the absolute devastation of the perfect family. Shirley was still weeping silently, her empire of church politics reduced to rubble. Trayvon was staring blankly at the wall facing federal prison and the loss of everything he had built on lies. Andre was a broken mess on the floor. It was a portrait of pure, unadulterated consequence. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the heavy silence. It was a cell phone ringing. The sound was loud and insistent, cutting through the tension like a physical blade. Everyone turned their heads, searching for the source of the noise. The ringing was coming from Harper Designer Handbag, which was sitting on a chair a few feet away from her. Harper head snapped up, her tear-streaked face suddenly illuminated with a desperate, frantic hope. She scrambled across the floor, her expensive silk dress tangling around her legs as she lunged for the bag. She practically ripped the leather open, digging her manicured fingers inside until she pulled out her phone. She stared at the screen, and a loud gasp of pure relief escaped her lips. "It is my father," Harper cried out, her voice shaking with a sudden manic energy. She looked at Trayvon and then glared at me with a sudden resurgence of her old aristocratic arrogance. "It is my father. He is calling me. He knows people in the government. He knows judges and politicians. He is going to fix this. My family will not let me go down with you pathetic people." She swiped the screen with trembling fingers and immediately pressed the speaker button, holding the phone up like a shield. She wanted everyone in the room to hear her wealthy, powerful father ride in on a white horse to save her from the consequences of her own actions. She wanted to prove that she was still superior, that her old money bloodline would protect her from the destruction I had unleashed upon this room. Daddy, Harper sobbed, leaning toward the phone, her voice pitching up into a childish, desperate whine. "Daddy, please, you have to help me. These people are ruining me. Trayvon lied to me, Daddy. His whole family is a fraud. They are trying to drag me down with them. The federal agents are raiding the restaurant right now, and they are going to arrest me. You have to call your lawyers, Daddy. You have to save me. Please tell me you are sending someone." The entire room held its breath, waiting for the booming, authoritative voice of an old money patriarch to echo through the speaker. We waited for the threats of elite legal action and the promises of swift rescue, but the voice that came through the speaker was not warm. It was not protective. It was entirely devoid of any fatherly concern. "Harper?" the voice said dryly, sounding incredibly tired and exceptionally cold. Stop screaming. You are embarrassing yourself. Harper froze, her mouth hanging open. Daddy, she whispered, confusion replacing the panic in her voice. Did you hear me? The IRS is here. They are seizing the business accounts. They know about the offshore transfers. I know they are there. Harper? Her father replied, his voice cutting through the speaker with absolute detachment. They were just here at the estate. They came with warrants about 30 minutes ago. Harper's eyes widened in absolute horror. Warrants? She stammered, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. What are you talking about, Daddy? Why would they go to the estate? Because you were stupid enough to link those fraudulent restaurant accounts directly to the family trust fund, Harper. He said, his voice dripping with profound disappointment. You tried to cover your tracks by funneling that dirty restaurant money through the holding accounts your grandfather set up. You tied my business, my legacy to your pathetic husband's illegal gambling ring. Harper let out a strangled cry, shaking her head back and forth. No, Daddy, no! I was just trying to pay off the loans you took out. I was trying to help the family. I was trying to save our image. You did not save anything, Harper, her father snapped, his voice finally raising in anger. You destroyed it. The federal agents have frozen every single asset we have. They have locked the trust funds. They are seizing the estate pending the investigation. You brought a federal money laundering case directly to my front door. You dragged this family name through the mud because you could not control your spending, and you married a common criminal to fund your lifestyle. Daddy, please, Harper begged, dropping to her knees again, holding the phone in both hands as if she were praying to it. Please, you have to help me. What am I supposed to do? I have nowhere to go. I have no money. Please, Daddy, I need you. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Harper held her breath, her tears dripping onto the illuminated screen of the phone. I am not calling to help you, Harper, her father finally said, his voice dropping back to that terrifying cold detachment. I am calling to tell you that you are entirely on your own. My lawyers are drawing up papers to completely sever you from this family. You are disowned, Harper. Do not call this number again. A sharp click echoed through the speaker, followed by the hollow, empty sound of a disconnected dial tone. The hollow electronic tone of the disconnected call echoed through the perfectly silent dining room like a flat line on a hospital monitor. Harper stared at the dark screen of her phone, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the expensive device straight onto the polished hardwood floor. The screen cracked upon impact, mirroring the absolute destruction of her entire reality. Her father's words hung in the air like a thick, toxic smoke, choking the life out of her carefully constructed aristocratic persona. You idiot, the IRS just froze my accounts because you used my social security number to guarantee that restaurant liquor license. You are disowned, Harper. Do not ever come back to this house. The brutal reality of her situation was finally breaking through her impenetrable wall of delusion. She had forged her own father's signature. She had used his pristine credit, his prestigious name, and his precious social security number to secure the liquor license for Trayvon's illegal gambling den. She thought she was so untouchable, so protected by her white privilege and her generational wealth, that the rules simply did not apply to her. She believed she could play in the dirt with criminals and wash her hands clean whenever she pleased, simply by smiling and mentioning her maiden name. But the federal government did not care about her country club memberships, or her designer shoes, or her summer vacations. They only cared about the paper trail, and the paper trail she had recklessly created led directly to her and her father. Harper let out a sound that was barely human. It was a guttural, animalistic screech that tore from the very bottom of her throat, shaking the crystal glasses on the tables. The carefully constructed image of the elegant, composed socialite was entirely, completely annihilated. She ripped at her own blonde hair, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Her expensive fake pearls rattled against her collarbone as she completely lost her mind. She looked around the room at the 50 guests who were watching her total destruction with wide, horrified eyes. She looked at Trayvon, who was still sitting on the floor, too consumed by his own terror to even look at his wife. She looked at Andre, who was still weeping at my feet, a broken shell of a man. She looked at Shirley, who was staring at her with pure, unadulterated hatred, blaming the white woman for ruining her perfect black family. And then she looked at me. I was still standing, perfectly still, perfectly composed, my brilliant son right by my side. The absolute calm radiating from my posture pushed Harper completely over the edge. Her mind shattered under the overwhelming weight of her own massive failures. She pushed herself off the floor, her ruined silk dress tearing at the seams as she scrambled forward. Her eyes were wide and manic, filled with a violent racist rage that she had hidden behind fake polite smiles for over a decade. "You did this!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she charged across the private dining room toward me. "You savage! You ruined my life!" I did not flinch, I did not step back, I did not even blink. I just watched her launch her pathetic broken body at me with zero fear. But she never even made it within 5 feet of me. The two massive men standing quietly by the heavy mahogany doors, the private personal security detail I had hired to escort me to this dinner, moved with terrifying professional speed. Before Harper could even raise her manicured hands to strike me, my lead security guard stepped directly into her path. He did not hit her. He did not yell. He simply absorbed her forward momentum, catching her by the shoulders and using her own wild, frantic energy to effortlessly spin her around. In one smooth, fluid motion, he pinned her firmly against the expensive wood-paneled wall of the private dining room. Harper thrashed and kicked violently, screaming vile obscenities as the guard held her in place without breaking a single sweat. "Let me go!" she shrieked, her face pressed hard against the polished mahogany wood. "Let me go, you animals. She ruined everything. She is just a maid. She is nobody. She is a savage." I walked slowly toward where she was pinned, my expensive designer heels clicking softly and rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I signaled for my guard to hold her steady, but give us a few inches of space. I stood directly in front of Harper, looking deep into her wild, bloodshot eyes. The physical contrast between us could not have been more absolute. She was a feral, shrieking mess, held back by sheer physical force. I was the absolute picture of controlled power, immense wealth, and undeniable superiority. "I am a savage," I asked, my voice dangerously low, perfectly calm, and entirely lethal. "I am the nobody, Harper. Look at yourself right now. Look at what your incredible breeding and your superior bloodline has reduced you to. You are pinned to a wall, screaming like a lunatic, while your husband cowers on the floor, and your wealthy father cuts you out of his will forever. You thought your skin color and your fake aristocratic manners made you inherently better than me. You thought you could walk into my home and insult my intelligence while you were secretly funneling stolen money to violent loan sharks." I leaned in slightly closer, letting her smell my expensive custom perfume, letting her feel the absolute undeniable reality of her crushing defeat. "I did not ruin your life, Harper," I said softly, ensuring every single precise word pierced her fragile, bruised ego. "You ruined it all by yourself. You were so greedy and so desperate to pretend you were better than everyone else in this family that you committed federal fraud. You stole from your own father. You stole from a community church. You tied yourself to a weak man who does not even respect his own mother. You built a pathetic house of cards on a foundation of pure arrogant stupidity, and you are angry at me because I simply turned on the fan." The guests in the dining room were completely silent, watching the wealthy, privileged daughter being dressed down by the black woman she had spent years abusing. The church elders stood near the doorway, shaking their heads in profound disgust at the racist language Harper had freely used. The word savage hung in the air, exposing the deep, ugly prejudice that had always fueled her hatred for me. She had finally shown her true racist colors to the entire community, and there was absolutely no going back from that exposure. Jamal stood a few feet away, watching the woman who had degraded him and his mother finally face actual justice. He did not look scared of her violent outburst. He looked at her with the same intellectual superiority he applied to complex physics equations. He saw her for exactly what she was: She was a biological equation of supreme entitlement that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own deeply flawed variables. Andre was still sobbing loudly on the floor, clutching his stomach, as the reality of his destroyed life washed over him. He watched the woman he had tried so hard to impress, the white sister-in-law, he had allowed to continually insult his own wife, completely lose her mind in front of his church community. Trevin was rocking back and forth, muttering incomprehensible words to himself, completely broken by the realization that he was definitely going to federal prison. Shirley was staring blankly at the ceiling, her lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer that no one in heaven was going to answer. And then a new sound pierced the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the room. It started as a faint mechanical wail in the distance, but it grew louder and more piercing with every passing second. The unmistakable sound of heavy police sirens. But these sirens were not fading away down the avenue. They were getting closer. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the faces of my terrified family in shifting neon colors of absolute doom. The guests turned frantically toward the window, expecting to see more police cars pulling up to the disgraced restaurant across the plaza. But the flashing lights were not stopping across the street. The powerful police cruisers were pulling directly into the private parking lot of the elite steakhouse. The heavy wail of the sirens cut off abruptly right outside the front doors of the building, sending a shockwave of fresh terror through the dining room. Harper stopped thrashing against the wall, her eyes wide with a new immediate terror. Trayvon stopped rocking, his breath catching in his throat. Andre slowly lifted his tear-stained head from the floor. Shirley gripped the edge of her table, her knuckles turning completely white. "They are not just at the restaurant anymore," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden terrifying silence. Downstairs, the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse lobby burst open with incredible force. We could hear the heavy tactical boots marching across the marble floor of the restaurant below. The authorities were not just seizing the building across the street. They had come to collect the criminals hiding in the private dining room. The heavy synchronized footsteps marched up the wooden stairs, growing louder and more deliberate with every passing second. Harper began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as the reality of her impending arrest became undeniable. Andre looked at me, his eyes begging for a mercy I would absolutely never give him. The heavy mahogany doors of our private dining room swung open for the final time. 6 uniformed police officers and 4 federal agents wearing dark, heavy windbreakers marched into the private dining room. Their heavy tactical boots pounded against the polished hardwood floor, completely shattering whatever fragile tension was left in the air. The harsh crackle of police radios and the metallic jingle of handcuffs cut through the soft, elegant background music playing from the ceiling speakers. The authorities did not care about the crystal chandeliers or the silk table runners or the expensive imported flowers arranged on every table. They moved with a terrifying, calculated efficiency, fanning out across the room to secure the exits and identify their targets. The red and blue lights from the dozens of police cruisers parked outside the steakhouse flashed brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the terrified faces of my family in shifting neon colors of absolute doom. The lead federal agent stepped forward holding a thick stack of manila folders. His eyes scanned the room coldly before locking directly onto the pathetic man sitting on the floor. He called out Trayvon's name, his voice deep and echoing with absolute legal authority. Trayvon let out a high-pitched gasp of pure terror. He scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping against the spilled wine and shattered glass on the floor. He desperately tried to put distance between himself and the federal agents, looking around like a trapped rat looking for a hole to crawl into. He bumped hard against a heavy oak dining table, knocking over a silver ice bucket and sending a dozen champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering glass made him flinch violently, but he could not escape. 2 massive police officers stepped right over the broken crystal and grabbed Trayvon by the shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. He tried to pull his arms away, weeping uncontrollably, but the officers were far too strong. They twisted his arms behind his back, and the sharp, definitive click of metal handcuffs echoed loudly across the silent room. The federal agent stepped right into Trayvon, face pulling a piece of paper from his folder. "Trayvon, you are under arrest for multiple federal offenses," the agent announced, reading from the warrant. "You are being charged with severe embezzlement wire fraud across state lines and operating an illegal underground gambling syndicate." Trayvon completely lost whatever tiny shred of fake dignity he had left. His knees buckled beneath him, and the two police officers had to physically hold him upright by his armpits to keep him from collapsing back into the broken glass. He turned his head frantically, his wide, terrified eyes searching the room until they landed on his mother. "Mom," he screamed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, hysterical shriek. "Mom, please do something. Tell them they cannot do this. Tell the bishop to call a lawyer. Tell them who we are. Mom, please save me." But Shirley did not move a single inch. She remained crumpled on the floor in the corner, her expensive custom church hat sitting crooked and forgotten on her head. Her golden child, the son she had worshipped and placed on a pedestal above everyone else, was begging for his life. But she had absolutely nothing left to give him. He had stolen her entire identity. He had used her blind faith to rob elderly widows and working-class families in her own congregation. He had destroyed her holy reputation and stripped her of her beloved church status forever. She slowly turned her face away from him, resting her forehead against the cold wooden leg of a dining chair. She wept bitterly for her own lost power, ignoring the frantic screams of her favorite son. She did not even look up to say goodbye as the officers dragged Trayvon kicking and sobbing heavily toward the mahogany doors. The second federal agent immediately turned his attention to the opposite side of the room. Harper was still pinned firmly against the wood-paneled wall by my private security guard. Her blonde hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her expensive designer makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The security guard stepped back respectfully, allowing the local police officers to take over the restraint. Harper fought them like a feral animal. She thrashed and kicked violently, her ruined silk dress tearing even further at the seams as two female officers grabbed her wrists. "Do not touch me, you animals!" Harper shrieked, her face red and distorted with intense demonic fury. "My father is a billionaire. You cannot arrest me. I am not like these people. You have no right to put your hands on me. I will have your badges for this." The federal agent looked at her with an expression of profound professional disgust. He did not care about her trust fund or her country club membership. "Harper, you are under arrest for aggravated identity theft and federal tax evasion," the agent stated loudly, easily, talking over her manic screaming. "You used your father's social security number and forged his signature to secure fraudulent commercial licenses, and you are going to federal prison." Harper let out a guttural scream of absolute denial. She threw her weight sideways, trying to break free, but her expensive high heels snapped under the pressure. She collapsed toward the floor, but the officers caught her, forcing her arms aggressively behind her back. The handcuffs snapped shut around her thin wrists, locking her into reality. She sobbed and screamed, thrashing wildly as they marched her out of the elegant dining room. She was paraded past the 50 wealthy guests, past the horrified steakhouse manager, and out into the main lobby to be publicly humiliated in front of the entire restaurant. The heavy mahogany doors slowly swung shut behind the authorities, cutting off Harper manic screaming, and Trayvon pathetic wailing. The silence that fell over the private dining room was heavy, thick, and utterly suffocating. The 50 guests who had been invited to celebrate a fake graduation and worship a fraudulent empire stood perfectly still in profound shock. The absolute destruction of the perfect family had played out right in front of their eyes. The bishop was the first person to move. He adjusted his dark suit jacket, picked up his black leather ledger from the table, and walked silently toward the exit. He did not look at Shirley. He did not offer a single word of pastoral comfort or a final prayer. He treated her like a toxic disease he needed to escape. The church elders immediately followed him, shaking their heads in disgust at the vile depravity they had just witnessed. One by one, the rest of the guests filed out of the room. They moved quickly, leaving their expensive half-eaten steaks and their untouched glasses of expensive wine sitting on the tables. They left their beautifully wrapped graduation gifts sitting on the display table, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the criminal ruins of this family. Soon, the massive, elegant room was completely empty except for me, Jamal, Shirley, and Andre. Shirley was still curled in a tight ball in the far corner, weeping silently into the hardwood floor, completely checked out of reality. Her world was dead, and she was mourning the ashes. Andre was still kneeling on the floor right where he had collapsed. His tears had formed a dark, wet puddle on the polished wood beneath him. He was trembling so violently that his shoulders shook with every ragged breath he took. He was the man who had spent his entire adult life trying to prove he was superior to my working-class roots. He had stolen his own son's college tuition just to buy a seat at a table that was now completely obliterated. He had betrayed his wife, his child, and his own moral compass to impress people who were now sitting in the back of a police cruiser. I looked down at him and I felt absolutely zero pity. There was no sadness left in my heart. There was only the cold, hard clarity of a woman who had finally excised a massive terminal tumor from her life. I turned slowly away from Andre and walked across the room toward the elegant display table. The beautiful custom graduation cake was sitting there untouched, its white frosting gleaming under the crystal chandelier. Right next to the cake was the dirty gray cleaning rag that Harper had thrown at Jamal's face just an hour ago. She had tossed that filthy rag at my brilliant son to remind him of my commercial cleaning business. She had used it as a weapon to put us in our place, to mock our honest labor and elevate her fake aristocratic status. I reached out and picked up the dirty rag. The rough, cheap fabric felt incredibly familiar in my hands. It represented years of grueling physical labor. It represented countless nights of scrubbing floors, managing properties, and building a foundation from the ground up while this family mocked my ambition behind my back. But it also represented the massive financial empire I had quietly built while they were busy destroying their own lives with greed and lies. I walked back over to the window where I had left my expensive designer bag resting on a chair. I opened the gold clasp and reached inside. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. The crisp white paper carried the full, massive weight of my absolute victory. I took the dirty cleaning rag, and I wrapped it carefully around the stack of legal papers, folding the rough gray fabric over the crisp white pages, and tying it securely into a tight, heavy knot. I turned around and walked slowly across the room. The sound of my designer heels echoed sharply against the hardwood floor, cutting through the sound of Andre's pathetic whimpering. Jamal stood by the window watching me with quiet, profound respect. He stood tall and strong, knowing exactly what his mother was about to do to the man who had betrayed him. I stopped right in front of Andre. I looked down at the top of his head, watching his shoulders heave as he cried like a beaten, cowardly dog. He had no power left. He had no family left to protect him. He was completely alone. I lifted the heavy bundle of legal papers wrapped in the dirty gray rag, and I dropped it directly onto his lap. The heavy thud of the documents hitting his legs made him flinch violently. He slowly raised his head, his face a complete mess of snot and tears. His eyes were bloodshot and swollen, darting nervously from my face down to the bundle resting on his expensive suit pants. He looked at the dirty rag, recognizing it immediately from earlier in the night. His shaking fingers lightly touched the rough fabric, absolutely terrified of what was hidden inside. "What is this?" Andre sobbed, his voice weak and pathetic, echoing horribly in the empty dining room. I looked down at him, feeling the supreme, untouchable power of a woman who held every single card. "Divorce papers." I said, my voice cold, steady, and entirely devoid of any mercy. "A civil lawsuit for the $150,000 you stole from your own son to fund a federal crime, and an eviction notice for the house." Andre let out a loud, pathetic gasp, shaking his head rapidly in absolute denial. His hands hovered over the bundle, refusing to open it, as if ignoring the papers would make them disappear. "You cannot evict me," he cried, his voice cracking into a high whine. "It is my house too. Desiree, we bought it together. I paid the mortgage every month. You cannot throw me out of my own home." I smiled. It was a small, sharp, terrifying smile, completely empty of any warmth or love. Which, by the way, I paid off in full last year, I said, letting the absolute crushing truth finally shatter his last remaining delusion. Andre froze, his mouth hanging open as his brain struggled to comprehend my words. I own Vanguard Holdings. Andre, I continued speaking slowly and clearly, so he would understand the absolute magnitude of his defeat. I own the commercial cleaning company you always looked down on. I own the massive holding firm that bought the debt on your brother restaurant. I own the building where your family was just arrested for federal crimes. And I own the deed to the house we live in. I paid off the entire mortgage while you were busy drinking expensive scotch and kissing your mother's feet. You own absolutely nothing. Andre stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to stop his heart. He looked down at the dirty rag on his lap, finally understanding that the cleaning business he had spent a decade being embarrassed by was the exact entity that now controlled his entire financial existence. The woman he had ordered to stop embarrassing him had secretly bought the very ground he walked on. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your bags and get off my property, I said, turning my back on him. I did not even wait for Andre to form a pathetic response to the reality of his complete destruction. His weeping faded into a pathetic white noise as I took a step toward the center of the room. The heavy, tense silence of the dining room was suddenly broken by the sickening sound of fabric dragging across the polished wood. I looked down and saw Shirley. The proud, arrogant matriarch of the family was literally crawling across the floor on her hands and knees. Her expensive custom church hat had fallen off completely, revealing her messy, unstyled gray hair. She looked absolutely deranged, her eyes wide and wild with a completely new level of sheer panic. She dragged her body over the spilled wine and the broken crystal from the shattered champagne flutes, not even caring that the sharp shards were cutting into her expensive Sunday dress. She reached out with both of her trembling hands and grabbed onto my designer shoe. Her grip was tight and frantic, like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft in the middle of a terrible storm. "Desiree, please," she wailed, her voice cracking into a hideous, desperate shriek that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Desiree, you have to listen to me. You have to help me. Please, I will be completely homeless. The bishop told me the church is pressing criminal charges against me tomorrow morning. They are going to take my house, Desiree. They are going to take my car and my bank accounts to pay back the building fund. I have absolutely nothing left. You have to let me live with you and Jamal. You are my family, Desiree. You are my daughter-in-law. You have to take me in." I looked down at the pathetic, broken woman gripping my shoe. This was the exact same woman who had spent the last 18 years making my life a living nightmare. This was the woman who had mocked my working-class background, who had told her son I was not good enough for him, and who had constantly tried to make my own child feel inferior to his golden uncle. She had sat in the front pew of her church every single Sunday, acting like a holy, untouchable saint, while secretly judging every single person she deemed beneath her. And now here she was, weeping and begging the cleaning lady she despised to save her from the cold streets. I did not kick her, but I slowly and deliberately pulled my foot backward, breaking her frantic grip on my shoe. Shirley fell forward slightly, her hands slapping loudly against the wet hardwood floor. She looked up at me with thick black mascara, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, expecting me to show the merciful grace she had never once shown me. I reached into my designer bag one last time. I bypassed my wallet and my car keys and my phone. My fingers brushed against a piece of glossy folded paper I had picked up from a community board just a few days ago. I slowly pulled the brochure out of my bag and held it out toward her. Shirley stared at the paper, her hands shaking violently as she reached up to take it. Her eyes darted across the bold printed text on the front cover, and her face instantly drained of all remaining color. It was a brochure for the Downtown Women and Family Homeless Shelter. It was a facility located right in the middle of the gritty inner city where the beds were hard and the meals were strictly rationed. It was exactly the kind of place Shirley used to drive past and loudly lock her car doors in absolute disgust. "You always loved to quote scripture to me, Shirley," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely detached from her suffering. You always stood at the pulpit and told your congregation that God provides for the righteous. You told everyone that faith and a pure heart would always guarantee a roof over their heads and food on their table. I looked down at her pathetic, trembling form, making sure my words sank deep into her completely shattered ego. Well, let us see exactly how much he provides for a thief. You can take that brochure and you can pray that they have an open cot for you tonight, because you will never step foot inside my house again. Shirley let out a hollow, devastated wail, clutching the homeless shelter brochure to her chest as she collapsed completely onto the floor. She curled into a tight ball, sobbing uncontrollably as the absolute reality of her new bleak life finally crushed her. She had lost her stolen money, her holy status, her golden child, and her precious home. She was nothing but a criminal facing absolute ruin. I turned completely away from the pathetic ruins of my former family. I left Andre crying into his heavy divorce papers. I left Shirley weeping over her shelter brochure. I walked gracefully across the room to where my son was standing perfectly still near the window. Jamal was watching me with an expression of profound pride and absolute deep respect. He had seen his mother endure years of quiet humiliation, and he had just witnessed her rise up and conquer every single person who had ever tried to keep her down. I stopped in front of him and reached out with gentle, loving hands. I carefully adjusted the collar of his crisp dress shirt and smoothed out his graduation tie. My fingers brushed against the soft fabric, feeling the strong, steady heartbeat of the incredible young man I had raised all by myself. I looked into his bright, intelligent eyes, and I saw a future completely free of toxic manipulation and generational cowardice. He was safe, and he was protected, and he would never have to bow down to anyone ever again. "Are you hungry, baby?" I asked, my voice softening into the warm, loving tone I reserved only for him. The cold, detached predator who had just destroyed a family was entirely gone, replaced by a mother who was simply ready to celebrate her amazing son. Jamal looked down at the beautiful custom graduation cake sitting on the display table next to the dirty gray rag. He looked at the expensive, untouched steaks getting cold on the dining tables around the room. Then he looked back at me, and a wide, genuine smile broke across his handsome face. He stood tall, his shoulders squared and his head held incredibly high. "Starving, Mom," he said, his voice filled with pure joy and absolute undeniable freedom. "Let us get out of here." I nodded, linking my arm proudly through his. Together we turned our backs on the silent, sobbing wreckage of the past. We walked slowly and deliberately out of the private dining room, leaving the heavy mahogany doors wide open behind us. We walked out of the steakhouse, leaving the flashing police lights and the terrible memories entirely behind us. We stepped out into the cool, crisp evening air, perfectly ready to start our brand new, beautiful life. The greatest lesson here is that shared blood never justifies abuse or exploitation. For years, Desiree endured cruel humiliation from a family that valued fake prestige over genuine loyalty. Instead of fighting their petty battles, she quietly built her own empire and secured her financial independence. True power comes from knowing your worth and refusing to shrink yourself to make toxic people comfortable. When you build your own solid foundation, no one can threaten your survival or your peace. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect yourself? Share your story in the comments below.